Alaska is beautiful until it tries to kill you. Out here, the nights stretch on for weeks, the cold burns like fire, and the silence can drive a person to the edge. But sometimes that silence shatters, by a scream no living creature could make, or by footsteps in the snow when no one else is supposed to be there. These aren't campfire stories. These are real accounts from hunters, hikers, and villagers who saw something in the blinding white and wish they hadn't. Out here, you don't just fight the cold, you fight what walks beneath the northern lights. This is Horror Whispers, and tonight you will hear 7 true Alaskan horror stories that will freeze your blood. If you dare step into the snow with me, hit subscribe, tap like, and leave a comment about the moment that chills you the most, because after this, you might never hear the snow the same way again. 3 friends from Anchorage, David, Luke, and Matt. Looking for one last winter adventure before the season turned, they chose a remote spot deep in the Talkeetna Mountains, far from any marked trail, a place Luke swore had the best view of the northern lights. The plan was simple: snowshoe in with their gear, set up camp by the frozen lake, and spend 2 nights away from everything. No phones, no noise, no people. The first day went exactly as they'd hoped. The air was crisp, the snow glittered in the pale sunlight, and the quiet was almost soothing. They pitched their tents, built a small fire, and watched the aurora ripple across the sky. But as night fell, the temperature plummeted faster than they expected. The fire became more necessity than comfort, and the wind began to pick up, carrying strange, hollow echoes from the forest behind them. It was David who first noticed the sound. A soft, steady crunching, like someone stepping lightly on packed snow. It wasn't the rhythmic sound of a rabbit hopping or the uneven skitter of a fox. It was deliberate. Footsteps. He froze, listening, and when he glanced at Luke and Matt, he could tell they'd heard it too. None of them spoke. The sound faded into the wind, and after a tense silence, they tried to laugh it off. Probably ice shifting on the lake. Probably nothing. But that night, long after the fire had burned down to embers, David woke to the same sound again. This time it was closer. Slow, deliberate steps circling their tents, crunch, 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 stopping every few seconds as if whoever, or whatever it was listening. He held his breath, too afraid to unzip his sleeping bag. Then the steps stopped altogether. The silence was almost worse. He stayed awake for hours, listening, but heard nothing more until dawn. The next morning, he didn't mention it. Neither did Luke or Matt. They spent the day snowshoeing through the trees, but there was a tension between them now, a quiet alertness in the way they glanced over their shoulders. When they returned to camp in the afternoon, they noticed something strange. Behind their tents in the untouched snow was a single line of footprints. They were large, longer than any of their boots, and spaced farther apart than a human stride. Matt tried to laugh it off, saying it must have been distorted by melting or drifting snow, but the air between them was heavy. They decided to build the fire bigger that night, keeping it burning until they went to bed. The light and heat gave them a false sense of security, but deep down each of them was listening, waiting. It started again just after midnight. The wind had died and the sound was unmistakable. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow steps moving around the camp. David's pulse pounded in his ears. Then came another sound, a faint, almost human breathing. It was low and heavy, like someone exhaling steam into the cold air. Luke suddenly called out, his voice shaky but loud. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. The breathing stopped. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of their own hearts hammering in their chests. And then, from somewhere just beyond the firelight, came a sound none of them would ever forget. A long, slow dragging, like something heavy being pulled through the snow. No one slept that night. At the first light of dawn, they packed up quickly, barely speaking. As they were taking down the tents, David noticed something that made his stomach drop. Just beyond where the firelight would have reached, the snow was disturbed in a wide, sweeping pattern, as if something had been crouching low, watching them. They began the trek back to civilization, but the feeling of being followed never left. Every so often, David swore he heard a faint crunch behind them, but whenever he turned, there was nothing. The trees pressed close, the silence felt heavier, and the cold seemed to sink deeper into their bones. When they finally reached the trailhead, they didn't celebrate or joke like they normally would. They just loaded their gear into the truck in silence. As they drove away, Matt broke it. "Did either of you see its face?" The others didn't answer. Luke just stared out the window, and David kept his eyes on the road. None of them spoke about that trip again. They didn't need to. The memory was carved into their minds. The sound of footsteps in the snow, the slow, heavy breathing, the dragging noise that made their skin crawl. And late at night, when the wind dies and the world goes still, each of them swears they can hear it again, faint and distant, getting closer with every step. It was supposed to be a straight drive, Fairbanks to Anchorage in one night. Olivia and her younger brother Ethan had made the trip before, but never in winter. The roads were slick, the air so cold it felt like glass in their lungs, and the darkness out here was different. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was thick, swallowing the edges of their headlights as if the night itself didn't want them to see what lay ahead. By the time they reached the stretch between Nenana and Denali, the snow had started falling harder. Big, heavy flakes that blurred the road and turned the world into a shifting white tunnel. The only sound was the steady thrum of the engine and the hiss of tires against ice. They passed no other cars for over an hour, and the silence between them began to feel like a third passenger. Then Olivia noticed the figure. It appeared out of the snow ahead. A man, walking down the side of the road. At first she thought he was a stranded driver, but as they drew closer, something felt wrong. He wasn't wearing a heavy coat or gloves, just a thin hoodie, his head bowed against the wind. His skin, in the brief flash of their headlights, looked pale and waxy, almost blue. They slowed as they passed him, but he didn't turn his head. He didn't lift a hand, just kept walking, slow and steady, as if the cold wasn't touching him at all. Ethan muttered, "We should stop." But Olivia's gut twisted. Everything in her told her not to. She pressed her foot on the gas and watched the figure fade in the rearview mirror. A few miles later, Ethan broke the silence. "Liv, I think he's behind us." She glanced in the mirror. At first there was nothing but swirling snow. Then in the faint red glow of the taillights she saw it, a dark shape, far back, moving in the same slow, steady stride. "That's impossible," she whispered. "We're going 60. But every time she looked back, he seemed a little closer. His pace never changed. He didn't run, didn't stumble, just walked. She gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white, and tried to focus on the road ahead. The snow was coming down harder now, and the world outside was shrinking into a claustrophobic tunnel of white and black. They passed a small sign for an upcoming rest area. Olivia decided to pull over, hoping to lose him or at least let her nerves settle. The lot was empty, the snow unbroken except for their tire tracks. They sat in silence for a moment, the engine idling, their breaths fogging the glass. Ethan finally said, "Maybe it's nothing. Maybe I just imagined." He stopped. His eyes were fixed on something behind her. Olivia turned her head slowly toward the driver's side window. The man was standing at the edge of the lot. Not close enough to touch the car, but close enough that she could see the frost clinging to his hair, the way his lips hung slightly open. His eyes, that was the worst part. They were pale, cloudy like ice over a frozen lake. Olivia threw the car into gear and slammed her foot on the gas. The tires spun for a heartbeat before catching, and the car shot forward. In the rearview mirror, the man was still standing exactly where he'd been, watching them leave. They didn't speak for the next 20 miles. The storm was worsening, the road a slick ribbon under their wheels. But as they rounded a bend, Olivia's stomach turned to stone. There, in the middle of the road, was the man, standing perfectly still, waiting. She swerved to avoid him, the car fishtailing dangerously before she regained control. In the mirror, he was gone, no trace of him in the snow. The rest of the drive was a blur of panic and whiteout conditions. They reached Anchorage just before dawn, parking in front of their apartment with the relief of survivors stepping onto dry land after a shipwreck. Ethan refused to get out of the car until Olivia did, both of them scanning the quiet street for any sign of movement. They went inside, locked every door, and tried to convince themselves they'd been seeing things. A trick of the snow, exhaustion, the mind's way of filling the dark with monsters. But that night, when Olivia finally let herself drift into sleep, she woke to the faint crunch of footsteps on the street outside. She went to the window, heart hammering, and looked down. The street was empty. The snow was falling again, erasing everything, but just before she turned away, she noticed them. A single line of footprints leading from the edge of the road to the base of their apartment building, and stopping directly beneath her window. Ruth had lived in Alaska her whole life, and she had never feared the snow. It was part of her, as natural as breathing. She worked seasonally at a wildlife research station far out in the tundra, a lonely post accessible only by snowcat or bush plane. The station was small, just 2 cabins, a storage shed, and a wind-battered radio tower, surrounded by miles of open, untouched white. In winter, it was rare to see another person for weeks. It was mid-February when the radio started acting up. Static, bursts of voices too faint to understand, and occasionally what sounded like someone whispering directly into the receiver. She assumed it was just the weather interfering with the signal, but the whispers unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. They weren't random. They had a cadence, as if someone was speaking words meant to be heard, but in a language she didn't know. The first time she noticed the tracks was after a night of high winds. The snow should have been smooth, all the previous day's prints erased, but there they were. A line of indentations leading from the far edge of the tundra to the back of her cabin. At first, she thought they were animal tracks, but they were too deep, too perfectly spaced, and barefoot. She radioed into the main base, mentioning them casually, but the man on the other end only chuckled. Probably some hunter messing with you. People get strange out there. The words did nothing to calm her. That night, the radio came alive again. Static, a faint voice, but this time she heard it clearly. "Let me in." Her hands went cold. She didn't answer. The voice repeated it, slow and patient. "Let me in." Then silence. She didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the cabin felt heavier. Every gust of wind seemed to linger at the edge of hearing, like something breathing outside. In the morning, she forced herself to check the back of the cabin. The tracks were there again, only this time they circled the building. Twice. By the 3rd day, the voice on the radio had changed. It no longer asked to come in. It just whispered her name, over and over, drawn out, almost savoring it. Ruth disconnected the radio entirely, but that night she still heard it, not from the static, but from the other side of her front door. She grabbed her rifle and stood in the center of the cabin, heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. The whisper came again from just beyond the thin wooden wall. She didn't answer. Then the sound changed. The voice began to hum. Low, tuneless, but deliberate. It moved slowly around the cabin, humming as it went like a predator circling its prey. When morning came, Ruth found the snow churned in a wide ring around the cabin as if someone had walked the perimeter all night. But there was something else. Handprints pressed deep into the snow in places, the fingers long and thin. She tried to convince herself to wait for her scheduled pickup at the end of the week, but by nightfall, the whispering had returned, louder now, no longer soft or patient. It sounded amused. When it spoke her name, it was almost sing-song. She barricaded the door with the heavy table, her rifle within arm's reach. Hours passed. Then came the knock, just once, sharp and deliberate. She froze. The knock came again, 3 times this time. She could feel the vibrations through the floor. And then, silence. Ruth waited, every muscle locked until her eyes grew heavy. She must have dozed, because when she opened them, the room was colder than it had ever been. Her breath hung in front of her in a thick cloud. She turned her head toward the window and her heart stopped. A face was pressed against the glass. Pale lips pulled into a thin smile, eyes colorless. It didn't blink. It didn't move. Just stared. She stumbled backward, rifle shaking in her hands, but before she could fire, the face vanished. The next morning, the sky was clear, the air still. The tracks were gone, erased by a fresh layer of snow. She could almost believe she had imagined it, until she stepped outside and saw the handprint on the window. Perfectly clear, pressed into the frost from the inside. When the snowcat finally arrived to take her back to base, the driver asked why she looked so pale. She told him she hadn't been sleeping. He nodded slowly and said, "Happens sometimes out here." Something in the quiet gets to people. Ruth didn't answer. She just looked back at the station as they drove away, wondering if the thing in the snow was watching her leave, and wondering if it could follow. In the summer months, the days in Barrow, Alaska never truly ended. The sun would dip toward the horizon but never vanish, leaving everything bathed in a strange, endless twilight. For some, it was invigorating. For others, it was maddening. For Daniel, it was just part of the job. He'd been hired as a seasonal caretaker for an abandoned whaling station on the coast. The place hadn't been used in decades, but it still stood. Massive wooden buildings, a creaking dock, and the skeletal remains of rusted machinery that once processed entire whales. The company paid him well to keep vandals out, maintain the property, and take daily photographs for insurance. Easy money, or so he thought. The first week passed without incident. He spent his days walking the shoreline, his nights reading in the empty office building. The only sound was the wind howling over the flat tundra and the slow, methodical slap of the waves against the dock. But on the 8th night, he woke to the sound of chains rattling. He told himself it was just the old machinery shifting in the wind, but when he went outside to check, the air was still. No wind, no movement. Yet the sound continued, faint but steady, coming from somewhere near the dock. He stood there for a long time, scanning the pale, endless horizon, but saw nothing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. The next day, while photographing the storage warehouse, he noticed something odd in the frame. A shadow in the doorway that hadn't been there when he took the shot. It was tall, thin, and crooked, like someone standing at an unnatural angle. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, but when he went to check the doorway, the air inside was bitterly cold. Colder than the sea breeze outside. By the second week, the nights felt different. Even with the sun hanging just above the horizon, the shadows around the station seemed darker, heavier. The smell of rot began to drift from the dock, even though he hadn't seen any dead fish or sea life nearby. And sometimes, late at night, he would hear the water lapping harder, like something large was moving just beneath the surface. One night, while making his usual perimeter check, he saw something on the beach. At first, he thought it was driftwood. But as he got closer, he realized it was bones, large curved ribs slick with seawater, half buried in the sand. They were far too big to be from any animal he knew was still alive in the area. And there were more of them, leading in a jagged trail down to the water's edge, as if something had dragged itself out of the ocean, or back into it. From that night on, the station felt watched. The feeling grew so intense that Daniel started keeping his back to the wall whenever he worked. The chains rattled more frequently, the smell of decay grew stronger, and once, while he was walking across the yard, he heard a wet, dragging sound behind him. When he spun around, there was nothing but an empty stretch of dirt and a trail of dark water leading toward the dock. On the 17th night, he woke to the sound of something knocking on the walls. It started slow, rhythmic, then grew louder, more impatient. He grabbed his flashlight and followed the noise out to the dock, where the air was thick with the stench of rot. The water below churned violently, though the sea beyond was calm. As he leaned over to look, something massive moved just beneath the surface. A pale, shifting shape, longer than the dock itself, and then it rose, just enough for him to see fragments of it through the waves. Slick, white skin stretched over something skeletal, a mouth lined with jagged bone instead of teeth, eyes that were nothing more than black pits. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coiled chains. The water went still, the thing gone as quickly as it had appeared. But the dock groaned as if something heavy was clinging to it from below. He ran back to the office, bolted the door, and sat with his rifle in hand until the pale daylight came again. In the morning, the dock was empty, but the wet trail of something dragging itself along the planks was fresh. Daniel lasted 2 more days before calling in the company's plane to take him back to town. He never told them what he saw. But later, in a small bar in Barrow, he overheard an old fisherman talking to a friend. The man spoke of something the Inuit once whispered about, a thing that came from the sea to claim the dead, but sometimes it came for the living too. Daniel didn't stay to hear the rest of the story. He just left, knowing that no matter how far inland he went, the sound of those rattling chains would follow him for the rest of his life. The village of Shungnak sat deep in Alaska's interior, where the Kobuk River wound through miles of tundra and spruce. Only a few hundred people lived there, and most of them kept to themselves. Outsiders rarely came, and when they did, they left quickly. Erin, a traveling wildlife photographer, arrived in early September. She'd been chasing caribou migrations but found herself stranded when her bush pilot got grounded by bad weather. The villagers were polite but distant, always watching her with an odd mixture of curiosity and unease. On her second night, an older woman named Aputi invited her in for tea. Over steaming mugs, Aputi asked Erin if she'd been down to the river yet. Erin admitted she had, just to take a few photos at dusk. The woman's expression darkened. "You shouldn't be near the water after sundown," she said. "That's when they walk." When Erin asked who she meant, Aputi only shook her head. "You'll know them if you see them, but if you see them, it's already too late." The next day, Erin dismissed the warning as folklore. She spent hours hiking the riverbank, photographing golden willows and the shifting light over the water. As the sun dipped low, she lingered longer than she should have. The air was perfectly still, the surface of the river like glass, until she noticed movement upstream. At first, she thought it was a moose wading in the shallows. But as it drew closer, she realized it was walking, upright but wrong. Its limbs bent strangely, joints too long, its head lolling unnaturally to one side. The figure was pale, almost translucent, and its face— no, not a face. Just a flat, smooth surface where features should have been. Erin backed away, her camera still hanging from her neck, but when she glanced back at the river, the figure was gone. She told herself it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump she'd mistaken for a person. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the sound of water dripping, even though her cabin was bone dry. At one point she sat up and swore she saw a shadow standing at the far end of the room, its outline faint, as if it were shimmering like heat above pavement. She blinked, and it was gone. The next day the weather turned and a thick fog rolled in from the river. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Erin stayed indoors, editing photos. That's when she noticed something chilling. In several shots from the previous day, the pale figure was closer than she remembered. Frame by frame, it seemed to shift position, its featureless head always angled toward her. By late afternoon, she was ready to leave Shungnak at the first chance. But that night, the dripping returned. This time it was louder, steady, coming from just outside her window. When she pulled back the curtain, she froze. The pale figure stood in the fog, no more than 10 feet away. Its limbs twitched in slow, unnatural spasms, and though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze bore straight through her. The river was nearly half a mile away, but water streamed off its body, pooling at its feet. She stumbled back, heart pounding, and bolted the door. For the next hour, she heard it circling the cabin, footsteps squelching in the damp earth. Sometimes it knocked softly, as if testing the wood. Sometimes it scraped along the walls. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. When she dared to look outside, there was no sign of it. Only a wet trail leading back toward the river, disappearing into the fog. The pilot returned later that morning, weather finally clear enough to leave. Erin didn't hesitate. As the small plane lifted off, she glanced down at the winding river below. That's when she saw them, not one, but dozens. Pale, faceless shapes standing knee-deep in the water, perfectly still, their heads all turned upward, watching the plane until the fog swallowed them from sight. She never went back to Alaska, but sometimes in the dead of night she hears dripping outside her apartment window, even on clear, dry days. She tells herself it's the gutter. She tells herself they can't follow her this far. But deep down, she knows the river always remembers, and what walks it is patient. The remote Alaskan town of Coldfoot was little more than a truck stop and a scattering of cabins surrounded by endless boreal forest. Winter nights swallowed the place whole, and even the most hardened locals avoided going out after dark unless they had to. Danny, a long-haul driver, was used to it. He'd been running freight up and down the Dalton Highway for years, and Coldfoot was his usual halfway point. That December he arrived just as a storm rolled in, thick, heavy snow falling in sheets, the wind howling like a wounded animal. The diner was nearly empty, just a few locals sipping coffee, their conversations low. The waitress, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, brought him his food and then leaned closer. "You're staying the night, right?" Danny shrugged. "Weather says it's gonna blow over by morning." Her face hardened. "Stay inside tonight. If you hear knocking, don't answer, no matter what it says." Danny gave her a strange look but didn't press it. Truckers heard all kinds of tall tales on the road. That night he bunked down in the small motel next to the diner. The storm grew worse, snow hammering the window so hard it rattled. Around midnight the knocking started, 3 slow raps against the door. Danny assumed it was another trucker stranded in the weather. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, except for a set of wet footprints leading away toward the exit. He closed the door and chalked it up to some prank. An hour later, it happened again. This time, the knock was followed by a voice. "Hey man, you got a light?" The voice was strange, muffled, but somehow sharp at the edges. Danny stepped toward the door but hesitated. The waitress's warning replayed in his mind. He stayed put. The voice called again, a little louder, a little closer to the crack under the door. "Come on, Danny, just a light, that's all I need." Danny froze. No one in Coldfoot knew his name. The storm outside was still raging, yet something about the voice made it sound like the speaker was smiling. He backed away from the door, heart pounding. The knocking turned into a slow scrape, like nails dragging across the wood. At 3 a.m., the power went out. The motel sank into darkness so complete that Danny could barely see his hand in front of his face. The wind outside howled, and in the faint gaps between gusts he heard the voice again, right behind the door. "Let me in. It's freezing out here." Danny pressed himself into the far corner of the room, gripping his flashlight but too afraid to turn it on. The doorknob rattled. The scraping grew louder, now circling the room, moving from the door to the walls to the window. And then it came from inside, the sound of wet footsteps on the carpet. Slow, deliberate, moving toward him. Danny's breath caught in his throat. He flicked on the flashlight. Nothing there. The room was empty, but the smell hit him then. A damp, metallic scent like rust and river water. The air grew colder, his breath clouding in front of him. From the shadows in the corner opposite him, the voice whispered again, soft and almost playful. "I didn't need a light after all." The flashlight flickered and died. The last thing Danny felt was something cold and wet brush against his face. When the storm cleared the next morning, the motel's manager unlocked Danny's room to check on him. The bed was neatly made. His keys and wallet were still on the nightstand, but there were wet footprints leading from the door to the center of the room, and then stopping abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. The locals said it wasn't the first time someone disappeared that way in Coldfoot, and it wouldn't be the last. They called it the one who knocks, always polite, always patient, and always smiling when you finally open the door. The Alaskan town of Nome is known for its brutal winters and long, dark nights. But there's a stretch of tundra north of the town that no one talks about. A wide, barren expanse the locals call the Hollow Mile. On maps, it's just empty land. In conversation, it doesn't exist. Claire, a search and rescue volunteer, heard about it only because she wasn't from there. A hiker had gone missing and his last GPS ping was right on the edge of the Hollow Mile. No one volunteered to search that area. When she pressed for answers, her team leader simply said, "If you hear it, you run. You don't look back." It was a cold February morning when Claire went out alone, determined to find the missing man. The tundra was silent under a blanket of snow, not even the wind breaking the stillness. She hiked for hours, following the GPS coordinates until she came to a flat, featureless stretch of white that seemed to swallow sound. No birds, no distant truck engines, nothing. Halfway across, she saw something ahead, a figure hunched over in the snow, unmoving. Relief and urgency surged in her, and she quickened her pace. "Sir," she called out. The figure didn't move. When she got within 30 feet, she realized it wasn't a man at all, or at least not anymore. It was a frozen body, its mouth open in a scream, eyes wide, pupils blown so large they looked like empty pits. The snow beneath it was churned and disturbed, as if it had fought desperately before freezing in place. And then she heard it. A faint sound at first, like wind whistling through ice. But it wasn't the wind. The sound rose and fell in a rhythm almost like singing. It was beautiful but wrong, the kind of wrong that makes your stomach twist. Every note seemed to vibrate inside her skull. Claire turned, scanning the horizon. The sound was coming from behind her. Out on the white plain, something was moving toward her. At first, it looked like a human figure, tall and thin. But with every step it took, its body shifted. Too many joints bending in the wrong directions, limbs lengthening and shortening as if it couldn't decide what shape to be. The singing grew louder, sweeter, and against every instinct, Claire felt herself drawn toward it. Her feet moved without her meaning them to, the cold air filling her lungs like a narcotic. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered her leader's words. If you hear it, you run. She tore her gaze away and stumbled backward, forcing herself to move toward the frozen hiker instead of the approaching thing. Her boots crunched in the snow and the singing faltered, replaced by a shrill, almost disappointed wail. She ran. The snow dragged at her legs like quicksand. The wail grew closer, the sound right behind her, almost inside her ears. Claire didn't dare look back. She focused on the dark line of trees at the far edge of the tundra, just visible through the haze. Her lungs burned, her breath ragged. The singing started again, this time softer, coaxing, promising warmth. She reached the tree line and didn't stop running until she collapsed in the snow among the pines. For several minutes she lay there gasping, too afraid to move. When she finally looked back toward the hollow mile, it was empty. Just a blank sheet of white under a pale sun. They never found the missing hiker's body. That night, as Claire lay in her bunk at the search and rescue station, she heard something faint through the window. A song. Soft, sweet, almost comforting. She told herself it was just the wind. But in her dreams, she was back on the tundra. The thing stood only a few feet away, its face shifting in and out of human shapes, each one almost familiar. It held out a hand to her, singing, and in the dream she reached for it. When she woke, her gloves were wet, and the smell of snow clung to her skin. No one in Nome ever goes near the hollow mile, not because of what they've seen, but because of what they've heard. And if you ever hear the song, they say, it's already chosen you. In the far reaches of Alaska's Aleutian Islands lies an abandoned military weather station known only on old maps as Site A-19. It was built during World War II, manned briefly, then shut down after several incidents the government never explained. Locals who live on the nearest fishing island say storms seem to gather unnaturally around it, as if the clouds are drawn there. No one visits, except for a man named Thomas Reeve. Thomas was a photographer with a taste for dangerous places. He'd heard about Site A-19 from a dock worker who swore he'd seen lights moving in its windows during a snowstorm. The story hooked him. A week later, Thomas hired a fishing boat to take him to the island. The captain dropped him off just before dusk, promising to return in the morning, though his voice was tight when he said it. The weather station loomed on a cliff, its black silhouette sharp against a bruised sky. The windows were shattered, the steel doors rusted, but the building felt watchful. Inside, the air was stale and bitterly cold. His flashlight beam slid across peeling walls, collapsed bunks, and frost-coated machinery. Every footstep echoed as if the rooms were much bigger than they appeared. He began setting up his camera when he noticed something strange. Every time he looked away from the entrance, the door seemed slightly more ajar. He told himself it was just the wind, though he hadn't heard any. By nightfall, a thick fog had rolled in from the sea. Through the broken windows, he could hear the low roar of waves smashing against the cliff. The temperature seemed to drop sharply, his breath billowing in front of him like smoke. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping from down the hall. It was slow and irregular, like someone knocking on metal with their fingernails. He followed it, the sound leading him deeper into the complex, down a narrow hallway lined with old observation rooms. The tapping stopped the moment he reached the last door. Inside was a small lab, most of the equipment covered in ice. But one thing stood out, a series of photographs pinned to the wall. They were faded black and white shots, but in each one was the same figure, tall, gaunt, face obscured, standing in different parts of the station. As he studied them, the air in the room seemed to vibrate, and from behind him the tapping started again. This time it was faster and closer. He turned. At the far end of the hall, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, stood a figure, It was thin, impossibly thin, like a shadow stretched across the walls. Its head tilted slowly and the tapping sound became louder, now a rapid drumming that seemed to come from inside his own skull. Thomas bolted back toward the main entrance, but every hallway looked the same, and the fog had seeped into the building, dulling his sense of direction. The tapping followed him, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes just behind his ear. Finally, he saw the open door but the moment he reached it, the sound stopped entirely. The fog outside had thickened into an unbroken wall of white. He couldn't see the cliff's edge, the sea, or the path back to the shore. Something moved in the fog. Slowly, darkly, it shifted toward him. The same stretched figure from the photographs, its body flickering between frames like watching an old film reel skip. He stumbled backward into the station, slamming the door, heart pounding. All night he sat in the corner of the main hall, hearing the slow, deliberate tapping moving through the rooms. At dawn, the sound stopped. When the captain returned, the station door was wide open. Inside, Thomas's camera lay on the floor, still recording. The footage showed hours of an empty hallway, until just before sunrise, a long, skeletal hand slid into the frame and reached for the lens. Thomas himself was never found. The captain swore he saw movement in one of the station's upper windows as he left the island, a tall figure watching the boat vanish into the fog. And now, the fishermen say, when storms gather around Site A-19, you can hear tapping drift across the water, keeping pace with the waves. In the interior of Alaska, there is a village so remote it doesn't appear on most maps. The locals call it Nunavik, and fewer than 40 people live there year-round. They hunt, fish, and keep to themselves. Outsiders are rare, and visitors almost never stay long. Except for Claire. She was a wildlife researcher sent north to study migratory caribou patterns. Nunavik was supposed to be her base for 6 months. She was welcomed politely, though she noticed something odd. No one went outside at night. Not for firewood, not for fresh air, not for anything. The first time she asked why, the shopkeeper just shook his head. "We don't open the door after dark." It was early November when the sun began to vanish, replaced by the long, deep stretch of winter darkness. On her 4th week, Claire stayed late in her small cabin reviewing maps. Around midnight, she heard a knock at her door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. She froze. Nobody in the village visited at night. Peering through the window, she saw nothing. No lantern light, no figure in the snow. But the knocks came again, 3 times, perfectly spaced. She didn't open the door. Eventually they stopped, and she convinced herself it must have been the wind. The next day she mentioned it to an older villager named Lena. The woman's face tightened. "What did you do?" Lena asked. "Nothing. I didn't open the door." Lena nodded slowly. "Good. Never answer it, no matter what it says." That night the knocks returned. 3 slow raps. And then a voice. It was her mother's voice, clear, warm, calling her name. "Claire, open up, it's freezing out here." Her mother was 2,000 miles away. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The voice continued, now sounding impatient. It told her the stove was leaking gas. It told her there was a fire. It told her she had to come out now. The lies came faster, smoother, until it began to sound wrong, like the words were being repeated by someone who didn't understand them. The next morning, she confronted Lena, demanding answers. Lena finally told her. Long ago, hunters had spoken of something in the tundra that hated the cold, not because it hurt it, but because it belonged to it. It traveled with the wind, finding the scent of the living and knocking at their doors. If you let it in, you were never seen again. By the 5th night, Claire was sleeping with her pillow over her head, trying to block out the knocks. But the voice had grown more convincing. It sounded like friends, family, even her own voice. On the seventh night, she awoke to silence, and then a whisper right against her ear. "You should let me in now." Her heart stopped. It was inside. She didn't remember grabbing the hunting knife, but when she looked down, it was in her hands. The cabin was pitch black, her lantern out. She backed toward the wall, pulse pounding. Something was moving in the dark. Not footsteps, but the sound of fabric dragging across the floor as if something was crawling toward her. Then the knocking started again. From inside the cabin. 3 slow raps against the wall right beside her head. When morning came, Lena and 2 other villagers found the cabin door wide open, the lantern smashed, and Claire's research notes scattered across the snow. There were no footprints, not even hers. Just a smooth, untouched layer of frost, as if no one had ever been there. Her voice, however, was still heard in the village for the rest of the winter. It came after dark, polite and patient, always beginning with 3 slow knocks. The village of Took was one of those places people forgot existed. No roads in, no roads out, only a frozen river that thawed for a brief window in summer. Elders spoke in a language outsiders rarely understood, and traditions were followed with a quiet, unshakable devotion. Erin came in as a documentary filmmaker, eager to capture the old ways before they disappeared. She'd heard whispers about a night of watching, an annual ritual in late January when no one slept, no lights were lit, and everyone stayed inside until the sun returned. She asked about it, but each time the conversation died instantly. One elder told her only this: "We do not sleep that night because it watches back." On the appointed evening, Erin tried to participate. Candles were snuffed out at dusk. Families huddled in silence, their eyes on the black windows. The cold was brutal, and the air seemed heavier than usual, as if something pressed against the walls. From time to time, Erin thought she heard movement outside, not footsteps, but a shifting, dragging sound like something enormous was slowly circling the village. Around midnight, she made a mistake. Curiosity gnawed at her. She cracked the shutter just enough to peek outside. At first, there was only the snow, dark and endless. And then she saw it. A massive, pale shape in the distance, moving slowly, almost gliding. No face, no arms, just a towering column of something that bent toward each cabin as it passed. She pulled back instantly, heart hammering. That's when she noticed the others in the room staring at her. Wide-eyed, terrified, as if she'd just sealed her own fate. One of them whispered, "It saw you." The rest of the night was worse. She could feel it outside, stopping at her cabin again and again. The air inside grew colder each time. She couldn't see it anymore, but she could hear it. The faint creak of the snow as it leaned close, the deep inhale of something without lungs. Just before dawn, the silence shattered. A deafening knock shook the cabin so hard the walls quivered, then another, then another. Everyone in the room pressed their hands over their ears, eyes squeezed shut. But Erin, she looked. She didn't remember moving to the door, only standing before it, hand on the latch. The knocking stopped. A voice, low, inhuman, but somehow using her own speech, whispered her name, drawing it out like a promise. And then nothing. The next morning, the sun rose over the village. People went about their day as though nothing had happened. But Erin's bed was empty. Her gear was still there, her jacket hanging on its hook, her boots by the door. In the snow outside, there was one single track, not footprints, but a long, smooth indentation leading away from her cabin into the endless white. The villagers did not search. By spring, no one spoke of her. And when the next night of watching came, the elders reminded the children of the one rule: never look outside, because it remembers the ones who do, and it always comes back for another. In the Alaskan fishing town of Kaluk, winter storms sometimes cut the place off for weeks. Supply boats stayed trapped in ice, and even the mail didn't come through. That's why nobody thought much of it when the post office got behind in December. Nobody except for Jacob, a part-time mail clerk who was asked to help sort a huge backlog when the ice finally broke. Among the usual boxes of dry goods and letters, there was one package that stood out. It was small, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. The strangest thing, it was addressed to him, but Jacob hadn't ordered anything. He opened it in the back room. Inside was a reel-to-reel audio tape, the kind his grandfather might have owned. No note, no instructions, just the old magnetic reel. His curiosity got the better of him, so he borrowed the recorder from the community center that night. When the tape began to play, it was mostly static. Then came the sound of heavy wind, not unusual for Alaska, and faintly footsteps crunching in snow. No voices, no music, just that. But about 5 minutes in, he heard his own voice. It was unmistakable. He was laughing, talking about a fishing trip from last summer. He had no memory of ever recording it. In the background of the tape, the footsteps grew louder, almost in sync with his voice, until they sounded right behind whoever was holding the recorder. The reel ended with a sudden, sharp sound, like someone inhaling, followed by silence. Jacob told himself it was some kind of prank. But when he went to bed that night, he couldn't shake the sound of those footsteps from his head. The next day, there was another package, same paper, same lack of return address. Inside was another reel. This one started with static again, but this time, there was no wind, only breathing, slow, steady, and close. Then, his voice again. This time it was him talking on the phone to his sister. He remembered that conversation vividly, because it had happened that morning. Someone had recorded it without him knowing. That night, Jacob barely slept. He kept checking the locks, staring at the window, swearing he saw movement in the snow. The third package arrived 2 days later. The postmark said it had been sent over a week ago, but that didn't make sense. It contained a reel of him walking to work. That very morning. At this point, Jacob tried to tell the sheriff, but the man just shook his head. It's winter. People get jumpy. Probably kids messing with you. By the fifth package, Jacob stopped going outside after dark. The tape showed him sleeping, recorded from inside his bedroom. He could hear himself breathing, shifting under the blankets. And beneath that, a second set of breathing, not in sync with his own. He smashed the recorder, burned the reels, and tried to ignore it all, but the packages kept coming. The last one arrived during a whiteout storm. Inside was a reel that began in complete silence. Then came the faint creak of a floorboard, his floorboard. Then the sound of a door opening. The final seconds of the tape were only 3 words whispered right into the recorder. "Turn around, Jacob." No one saw him after that night. When spring thawed the harbor, the post office cleared the last of the winter's backlog. In the pile was a small brown package, no return address, addressed to current occupant. Inside was a single reel-to-reel tape. It began with footsteps crunching through snow, and the sound of someone laughing,